Thanks for your company this morning. The federal government is today beginning a broad-ranging debate on tax reform, including the rate and base of the goods and services tax. The Treasury has issued a discussion paper saying Australia's GST is one of the lowest in the developed world at 10%. It suggests a GST of 15% could raise $80 billion worth of revenue instead of the current $56 billion each year. Now, let's look at the composition of the tax system. As you can see from this pie chart, personal income tax at 39% and company tax at 19% make up the majority of the taxation collected by the government. GST just 12%. Income taxes as a percentage of total taxation, you look at this comparison with other developed nations, Australia second only to Denmark on that comparison in terms of the amount collected by income tax and company tax compared to other developed countries. Now, the Assistant Treasurer Josh Frydenberg last night was on the Viewpoint program discussing the issue of the GST in the broader discussion paper.
In tomorrow's paper, there will be a section on the GST which shows where we are compared to other countries, and we have a relatively low consumption tax level compared to other countries. It also shows that around 47% of goods and services are subject to the consumption and to our GST, which is also relatively low. But the political reality is, and Tony Abbott's made this point in the Parliament, the Labor Party would need to support any increase to the GST for it actually to become a reality.
And we're live now to the Assistant Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Assistant Treasurer, you make that point about Labor needing to support the GST, any change, but doesn't the election result in New South Wales at the weekend show that difficult reform proposed and prosecuted by government effectively can work?
Well, certainly Mike Baird had a wonderful victory, and it was testament to his leadership, but also, as you say, to his political courage to be prepared to take the controversial poles and wires policy to the Australian electorate, or to the New South Wales electorate. We too, at the national level, will always take important policies to the people to get a mandate from them. In terms of tax, we are also very keen for this discussion paper to start a year-long conversation, which will then crystallise in a white paper closer to the election with specific policy proposals. Now, when it comes to the GST, the reality, though, Kieran, is we cannot change the GST without the support of all the states and territories, and that includes Labor states and territories. And Bill Shorten, in his 18 months as opposition leader, has shown he's much more interested in politics, not policy. So the political reality of changing the GST is not one that's on the table.
You could actually override it, though, through federal legislation if you did have the willingness to do so. And I guess that goes back to the point about Baird and the message that election win shows governments, that if you articulate, explain, that people will come with you.
Well, let's have this discussion in a year's time and see where the Australian public is, because you're right, maybe the debate could influence voters, but also the Labor Party. But that would be very hopeful indeed. Because right now they've shown only political opportunism when it comes to serious policy discussions. So I think in this paper what you'll see is an interesting conversation, interesting data, not just about the GST, which, by the way, was excluded from Ken Henry's report under the previous Labor government, but also about the over-reliance in Australia on income and company taxes. I mean, we have 800,000 companies in Australia, Kieran, but only 12 companies produce 1/3 of our corporate tax take. Right now, we spend $40 billion as a community on compliance with our tax system. We have 125 taxes, but just 10 taxes produce 90% of the revenue, and 115 taxes produce just 10% of the revenue. So complexity is a big issue too.
With that over-reliance on those two main areas of company tax and income tax, and bracket creep obviously going to prove a problem over the next decade as well, is it indirect taxation that needs to pick up more of the slack?
Well, let's just see where the discussion goes. No doubt it is the composition of our tax base that we have to think about. The other challenge we've got to company tax is the mobility of investment and capital, and which means that in the United Kingdom they're moving to a 20% company tax rate. In Singapore it's 17%, and here in Australia it's 30%. So the economic costs to the economy, Kieran, from having a relatively high company tax is actually quite significant. It means jobs and investment go offshore. So we also need to bear in mind not just the amount of revenue that we're taking, but what is the net impact on job creation, investment, business decision making as a result of having a high company tax rate.
Now, what about issues like the, for example, the superannuation tax concessions? That's seen as something that has to be dealt with. I guess capital gains tax is something as well that's being discussed here as a possible area of reform. Are these you know, super for example seems like it's a no-brainer. Is the government heading in that direction ahead of the next election?
And you could also add negative gearing to that list too, Kieran, because that's discussed in this paper in terms of the positives and negatives of that policy. Well, superannuation is a very interesting issue because the paper refers to the sustainability of the budget over time as a result of people being able to access their savings in superannuation effectively tax-free. And that is a real issue as we have an ageing of the population, and governments are required to spend more on health policy in particular. So we're prepared to have that discussion. The interaction between the tax system, the superannuation system and the welfare system in regards to the pension is a really interesting discussion. It's something that Scott Morrison has looked at in detail in the context of his portfolio, because we do have an ageing of the population. We do want people to work for longer, and we also have to be very mindful of the sustainability of the budget, both from the tax concession perspective of superannuation, but also from our commitments in relation to the age pension.
And finally, in terms of the timeline here, today it's the discussion paper. What can people expect from the government in terms of this debate from here through until you propose the reforms to take you know, as your platform to the next election?
Well, we're asking interested parties, whether they're individuals or companies, not-for-profit organisations. There's an interesting chapter on not-for-profits in this report as well, to all make submissions to the government over the coming months. Then around mid-year we'll put out what is called a green paper or an options paper, which looks at various options, and then we'll have a white paper next year ahead of the election, which will form part of our election platform that we will seek a mandate from the Australian people, because tax reform is long overdue, and a continuous theme in this report, Kieran, is that our reliance on income and company tax is around the same as it was in the 1950s, and with the increasing digitalisation of the economy, with the increasing reliance on the internet for people to purchase their activities from overseas, and with the mobility of investment and labour and capital, these are opening up real questions for us about the sustainability of our revenue base and also the economic costs of our tax system.
Assistant Treasurer, I appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for that.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Kieran.
Flames